All right, welcome World History. Hopefully you guys are dealing with your quarantine successfully, that you're not going too crazy, that you're getting things done and you're being helpful around the house. So it's not the way that I like to be doing this, of course. I truly wish we were back at school. I'm hoping you guys wish you were back at school as well. But I figured, given the fact that we will not be in school for all of April, that maybe we needed to have a way for me at least to explain some of the things that you are reading about and learning about, hopefully, over the last couple weeks, and what we will be learning going forward. All right, so this is my attempt to, I guess it's not quite a crash course video of sorts, but it's a way for me to at least communicate with you and hopefully draw those connections. So this week, you have been reading about, or you should have been reading about in chapter 20, section 1, the beginnings of the Cold War. And this is a really, really important time as we look at the events that take place after World War II and then moving forward to even current times. These issues still reverberate and are at issue in some places and some things today. So this is one of the reasons why I want to make sure that I at least try to communicate some of this stuff to you. And in particular, you know, the first thing I had you try to answer is this question about the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the Berlin Airlift. And so those are kind of things I want to address here today. And then we'll kind of pick it up as we go, because section 1, like I said, has a lot to it, and I want to take some time. And hopefully these videos are only like 10 to 15 minutes. So we'll kind of see how it goes. So when we look at the Europe in particular, at the end of World War II, what we have is a divided Europe, right? We have a Eastern Europe that is controlled by the Soviet Union, and we have a Western Europe that is allied, at least, with the United States. All right, these are your democracies of Europe versus your communist-controlled sectors of Europe, East and West. All right, and so the division is very, very clear after World War II. We had hoped, at least, that free elections would be taking place in those Soviet-controlled areas, but of course that just didn't happen. And no place is more of a symbol of the issues of the Cold War after World War II and the divide in Europe than, of course, Germany, and then subsequently Berlin, all right? Because Germany is going to be divided. You're going to have a West Germany, where the United States, France, and Britain will control certain portions of that. And then you have an East Germany, where the Soviet Union is controlling. Now, of course, within the eastern section, the Soviet section, you have the city of Berlin, the capital. And Berlin is going to be divided as well. You have West Berlin, controlled by the United States, France, and Britain, and East Berlin, controlled by the Soviet Union. And so the idea, of course, was that after a certain amount of time, free elections would take place, Germany would be unified, and we would move on. But of course, that is just not going to happen. The Soviets were very critical of their allied partners, in particular the United States and Britain. Following the war, they wanted a buffer zone to protect them, knowing they had lost, close to 30 million people to German aggression between World War I and World War II. And of course, we didn't trust the Soviets that that buffer zone was anything more than a land grab for them. And so this is kind of the beginnings of that Cold War animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union. So as the Soviet Union is expanding their control in Eastern Europe, the one thing that we begin to try to do is to address the issue of the spreading of communism. We wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. And so President Truman decides to issue a doctrine that we would aid nations that were at threat of becoming communist. In particular, Turkey and Greece was kind of the initial focal point of the Truman Doctrine. And this whole policy of containment. We wanted to contain communism. We didn't want it to spread. We couldn't really do anything about where it was after World War II, but we just didn't want to spread further into Europe. And so the Truman Doctrine was this idea of containing communism by giving aid and support to nations who were threatened. Now, one of the ways we did that was we initiated what became known as the Marshall Plan, where we will infuse billions and billions of dollars into investing in the rebuild of Western Europe. Now, we did offer the Soviet Union money as well, but of course they were going to turn us down. But the Marshall Plan is an extreme success. Marshall wins a Nobel Peace Prize for the efforts that we went forward in providing that aid to Western Europe. And there will be a distinct difference that the areas that took the Marshall Plan aid will grow and flourish after World War II much more quickly than the Soviet sectors will. And of course, this, continues to give us, credibility in our response of, United States and democracy is the way to go rather than communism in the Soviet Union. And so as Western democracies are beginning to flourish after World War II, we don't see that quite same thing going on in Eastern sectors. All right. So in particular, when we look at Germany and Berlin, this became pretty evident. And so the Soviets wanting to have all of Berlin, they didn't want to have the United States having influence within their sector. And so what the Soviets are going to do is they're going to take an aggressive move and they're going to blockade the aid that's coming in through the rail lines into West Berlin. Thinking that we wouldn't be aggressive, that we wouldn't, what options would we have? If they shut off aid, we could militarily try to go in there, but we weren't going to risk a war with them. And so they were kind of taking the gamble that we weren't going to try to do anything other than just let them have it. But of course, we weren't going to let them have it. Again, containment. We don't want it to spread. And there's millions of people in the western sector of Berlin, and we didn't want them to fall into communist hands. And so what could we do? And what we came up with is an airlift. We could fly our planes over East Germany into West Berlin and drop supplies in hourly if we needed to. And of course, the threat there is that the Soviets could shoot down the planes. And of course, if they do that, we would have to respond militarily as well. And so it wasn't an easy decision, but we ended up deciding that, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to fly our planes in, and we're going to aid West Berlin. And we do so, all right, for 345 days, almost a whole year. We are sending hourly sorties to drop off supplies into sectors of Berlin so that they have food, they have materials to build, that they have medicines, whatever they need, we're providing it for them. And eventually the Soviet Union will back down. They'll reopen the rail lines and allow us now to have access to West Berlin. And so it was an early challenge to the U.S. Proposals of containment to our plan to make sure that communism didn't spread. And the Soviets were testing us there. And of course, Truman and the issuing of the airlift is a successful kind of response to that, all right? And so this is kind of how the Cold War gets kicked off, all right? It's this kind of East versus West mentality. Now, of course, the United States, we begin to enter into an alliance with these Western nations. We call it NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And NATO basically is United States, it's Canada, it's Iceland, it's Britain, it's France, it's the Norwegian nations, it's Germany, all these nations that are democratic after World War II, they're all our allies. And the whole purpose of that is what we call a mutual defense alliance. The idea is an attack on one is an attack on all. So if the Soviets make an attack on West Berlin, that's like attacking Britain, France, the United States, Canada, everybody. All right, so it's well known that you take an attack on one, you are attacking everybody in NATO, so don't do it. The Soviets will respond with their own pact, known as the Warsaw Pact, which will be basically the Soviet Union and all of its what we refer to as satellite nations. All right, so if the Soviet Union is Russia, you have all these satellite nations around it. All right, so what is today Ukraine? Of course, Poland's going to be part of that. Romania. If we go down further south, you'll have all the stands, the Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, all those as well are part of the Soviet satellites. Anyway, these are going to be all part of the Warsaw Pact. And so you have NATO on one side, you have the Warsaw Pact on the other, United States, Soviet Union, Cold War really kind of kicking off. Of course, in the 40s, we see that the Soviet Union is testing their nuclear bomb. And so now they will be a nuclear power as well. So now that kind of adds more intensity and more kind of seriousness, of course, to this Cold War development that is happening. And so, those are kind of the big issues at the beginning of Chapter 20, Section 1, as we look at the initial division that occurs after World War II. And, of course, the the Cold War really kicking off. And of course, there's going to be much more. You know, when we get into the section, it talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 60s. It talks about, of course, the Korean War in the 50s. It talks about the Vietnam War in the 60s into the 70s. I mean, all these things are kind of thrown together here in this first sector. And so we're going to take some time and make sure that we kind of hit each one of these things as we go along. And so what you were supposed to be doing, of course, you know, towards the end of this week is watching, doing the readings on Korea and Vietnam and watching the videos from Khan Academy. So hopefully you're doing that as well, and then I'll kind of add some things to Korea and then to Vietnam next week. All right, so we'll kind of call that one the first one here, and we'll kind of see how things go, and maybe I'll have some discussion about whether or not this is beneficial, maybe other ways to do some things as we move forward if you have any suggestions. But hopefully you guys are all healthy, and of course, stay safe.